Everyone, I'm Lakara Barnes-Rowe and I'm a careers consultant here at Queen Mary. It's lovely to be able to welcome you to this webinar where we'll be exploring disability, disclosure and access to work. So before I launch into the content of our session, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things. So this is quite an information-heavy presentation, so it might draw up some, a number of questions, or just you might be able to draw parallels between things that I'm saying and things that might resonate with yourself in your own personal circumstances. So you'll have quite a few opportunities here just to reflect. Now, what I encourage you to do, if there is anything that does come up for you that you want some further assistance or guidance on, you're very welcome to book a follow-up appointment with me. I'm going to leave my email address at the end of the presentation, so feel free to get in contact and we can maybe book a face-to-face appointment to kind of look at how some of these issues might relate to you and your own circumstances. So the conversation that we're about to have is going to provide you just a chance to learn about the support that exists in the world of work. It's just going to give you a moment or two where you can start thinking about what might work best for you. So I just want to emphasize something that's quite important to those of you who are listening in. While I'll be speaking in quite general terms, it doesn't mean that staff here at Careers and Enterprise see you as a homogenous group. We understand that disability is incredibly broad, and the implications of having a disability at work will vary massively depending on the nature of your disability, the role that you're doing, and the sector that you're working in, among a number of different factors. And we're also going to grapple with some quite complex issues around the decisions that you might make in the working world. And I think disclosure might be one of the most contentious, so I don't know whether or not you'd agree with that. But with that said, I do want to clarify that it's not my intention to kind of steer you down one path or another. The choice is entirely in your hands, and that's exactly the way it should be because you know best. So we're going to be kind of thinking around a number of different topics regarding disclosure and kind of thinking about, how you might approach it from a few different angles. And you can then weigh up what might be best for you. So very much want you to see this as an initial conversation with plenty of room for follow-up in a one-to-one or perhaps through some additional research. And as I say, you've got access to my contact details, so you can get in contact with me should you wish to. So just in terms of broader context and like the labour market, I think it's quite interesting to have this conversation against the backdrop of all of the diversity initiatives that are taking place across the UK. So I don't know whether you would have come across this in your own job hunting, but there are a number of different diversity drives that are taking place. And I think disability is creeping up the agenda, and the narrative around certain disabilities is becoming a bit more progressive. And there's a few more things in terms of like resources within the sector as well. So you may have come across, the Civil Services Autism Exchange Programme. You may have seen the corporate sector engaging actively with charities like Employability or My Plus Students Club to offer work experience and also graduate roles. And then, of course, the Disability Confidence Scheme has been around for quite some time. So we'll have a chance to delve into these issues and look at what employers are doing as well to become more inclusive a bit later on. But I'll say despite a lot of the kind of movements towards progress, it probably doesn't make the issue of whether or not to disclose any less contentious. So the issues there are just as relevant as they've ever been. So we've got quite a few things to delve through this afternoon, and I think even though this is quite information heavy, there's probably loads more that we could say on the topic, but time just doesn't allow for it. So what I thought I would do is try and tailor it to issues that are probably going to be on the horizon for you at the moment as graduates. So the focus is going to be on like the application process, interviews and job offers. So if you want to talk to me about anything that might follow, so some of the issues that may crop up whilst you're on the job, again, that's just another really good excuse to come in for an appointment. So as far as the different sections, we're going to be exploring your rights. So that's a chance for us to get to grips with the Equality Act and what reasonable adjustments are. We'll also have an opportunity to think about disclosure. We'll also be thinking about access to work. So that's another really fantastic scheme. So it's a grant that you can take advantage of. So we'll think about how that works. And then finally, we'll round off by identifying inclusive employers. So finally, I've tried to kind of think about the presentation, how it's formatted as much as possible. But just in case there are any slides or perhaps the content overall is not in the most ideal format for you, do get in touch and we can think about how I can tweak it for you and then send you another copy of the presentation afterwards. Or alternatively, I can also send you a transcript if you'd find that helpful. Okay then, so before we talk about the disability-specific content, I think it's worth reminding you that actually as graduates of Queen Mary, you've got access to our provision for another 2 years. So that means that you can see us for one-to-ones, you can also book a series of graduate coaching sessions, which I'm running, and you can attend events and access loads of different resources, whether that's in hard copy format or digitally. So in terms of access, we make every effort to be as inclusive as possible, and we factor this into the way that we plan and deliver our work. But of course, we can't preempt every eventuality. So this is where we'd like you to come in. So when it comes to accessing the resources that we provide, or perhaps even coming along for events, I just want to reassure you that you're 100% welcome and encouraged to ask us to be flexible about how we do things. And any requests of this nature are going to be dealt with discreetly and confidentially. So a couple of examples of what we've done in the past in terms of adjusting the way we do things are our 40-minute appointments. So our standard appointments are 20 minutes, but we have doubled that time for those who may need a little bit of extra time to express themselves, talk through complex issues. So again, if you'd like a 40-minute appointment as opposed to one which is 20 minutes, you're very welcome to book onto that. Additionally, when it comes to our on-site events, we factor in access as well. And so one of my colleagues has been experimenting with opening fairs or busier events with a quiet hour so that you don't have to wade through the crowd. So let's say, for instance, it's a job fair. You can come in an environment that's a little bit more relaxed and then take the time out to talk to employers. So those are just a couple of different things that we've been trialing, but of course we'd absolutely love to build on this practice, and we can't do that without you. So please do get in contact if there's anything that we can do to ensure that specific events are more accessible. And also if you've got any ideas of things that occur to you while you're a student, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. Okay, so disclosure, frequently asked questions. So if you were to Google the phrase making a disclosure at work, you'd come up with all kinds of results. And some of them might be for countries abroad that may not be quite as relevant, with information that may not be as relevant to the UK labour market. Now, since the bulk of the webinar centres on issues to do with disclosure, it's probably quite useful to begin by defining what the word actually means. So what we're specifically referring to in this context is sharing the fact that you have a disability with your employer. Now, it's worth saying that the decision as to whether or not you choose to make a disclosure is totally up to you, unless there are any health and safety issues that your employer needs to be aware of. So that's the only caveat. And there are a couple of different reasons why a person might be motivated to disclose. So the first being, they might need the employer to make some reasonable adjustments in order to do their job. So we're going to explore exactly what reasonable adjustments are a little later. And then the second reason could be about engaging with colleagues and just a kind of wider workplace experience. So I have a couple of scenarios to talk through with you. So one could be that there's a member of staff who is receiving some reasonable adjustments in the form of updated office furniture or some new software or a piece of technology. Now, if the rest of the member of staff's colleagues don't necessarily have that context as to why they're receiving those additional pieces of software or furniture, it may come across as maybe favourable treatment or preferential treatment. And that probably sounds quite petty, but again, these things can crop up in the workplace. So a member of staff might be quite keen to have that managed carefully and may then feel it's appropriate to speak to a manager or a member of HR about how it can be managed sensitively. Another similar scenario could be perhaps you've got a member of staff on the autistic spectrum, or perhaps someone with a generalized anxiety disorder who may experience difficulty with being able to build relationships with members of staff. So, for instance, if you're in an open plan office and there's a lot of hot desking around, it's kind of a constant influx of new people, that might be quite overwhelming in certain circumstances. So again, a disclosure may just enable you to speak to your line manager about what support and what measures could be implemented to really kind of assist that settling in phase of a new job. Now, the flip side is there are also reasons for why those with disabilities may not wish to disclose. And they might include, the first probably is the most obvious. So the disability may have absolutely no impact on your ability to secure a job. It may have no ability on your, it may have no impact, on your ability to actually do the job, or on your general experience of the working world. So if you don't feel that there's any bearing on your experience of work, you're probably not going to be inclined to even think of making a disclosure. Next, it could well be that you're concerned about being treated differently. So perhaps there's a sense that if you do disclose, your disability will become the primary focus or something that you become defined by, as opposed to who you are and what you bring to the table in the world of work. And then finally is the issue of discrimination. So that comes up quite a lot in one-to-one appointments actually. And maybe there are some concerns around how you'll be treated and perhaps being treated unfavorably because of your disability. So just on that point, the next section is just going to enable us to explore the protection and the assistance that exists for disabled workers. Okay, so some of you may already have heard of the Equality Act 2010, but don't worry if you haven't, because I'm going to give you a very simple overview of what it is and how it helps. So the Act is a key piece of legislation that protects you against discrimination in the workplace, and it protects those with what's known as protected characteristics. So in addition to disability, the other protected characteristics are age, race, marital status / civil partnership, gender, sexual orientation, religion, gender reassignment, and pregnancy and maternity. Now that's quite a mouthful, but I think it's probably worth being aware of what they all are, because in addition to having a disability, you may also have one or more of the other protected characteristics. So the gov.uk website offers the following overview. So I'm going to read from the slide now. So the Equality Act 2010 legally protects people from discrimination in the workplace and in wider society. It replaced previous anti-discrimination laws with a single act, making the law easier to understand and strengthening protection in some situations. It sets out the different ways in which it's unlawful to treat someone. Find out more about who is protected from discrimination, the types of discrimination under the law, and what action you can take if you feel you've been unfairly discriminated against. Now, I've left a link on there that you can click through to as well and do a little bit more research. And I do recommend that you kind of get to grips with the Act, because it is quite a key piece of legislation there that works for your to your advantage. Now, let's explore reasonable adjustments. So I've used this term quite a few times already, and I think it's probably crucial that you're confident that you know what these are, because it's one of the most important provisions under the Equality Act that can help you receive the support you need from your employer. So the Equality Act offers protection in a wide variety of circumstances, but when it comes to the duty to provide reasonable adjustments, the employer can only really do this if they know you've got a disability. Now, this is something that you might want to bear in mind if you need to arrange some assistance before the employer has had a chance to meet you. Now, a prime example is you've been invited to interview and you need some reasonable adjustments to actually do the interview. So that might involve you making a disclosure, because obviously the employer can't do much if they don't know. And it may also come into play if your disability isn't visible. So according to the gov.uk website, reasonable adjustments are intended to ensure that those with disabilities are not significantly disadvantaged while doing their jobs. And examples might include, so I won't go through all of these, but I'll just pick a few. So changing the recruitment process so a candidate can be considered for a job. So again, these reasonable adjustments don't just come into play once you've got the job, but they also relate to the recruitment process as well. So that's something that's important for you to know. So I'll skip a couple. So making physical changes to the workplace, like installing a ramp for a wheelchair user or an audio-visual fire alarm for a deaf person. And just skipping further down still, allowing employees who become disabled to make a phased return to work, including flexible hours or part-time working. So once again, there are some additional information that I think it's wise to be aware of, and you can do a bit of follow-up research via the link provided on the slide. Now, I think as a recent graduate, the idea of being quite proactive and asking an employer for what you need in terms of requests for reasonable adjustments probably seems a little bit daunting, but please don't worry. Try and remember that as a member of staff, of course, you're an asset, and it's in the company's best interest really to ensure that you're able to do your job to the best of your ability. So in the end, reasonable adjustments are actually as advantageous to the employer as they will be for you as a member of staff. So just a key note though, so it's worth bearing in mind that these adjustments are those which are needed to actually do the job and not general assistance with your disability. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. Now, another point that I just want to raise in regard to reasonable adjustments are about their limitations. So, I mean, they can go a very long way, but they do have limitations. So, I mean, one of which is suggested by the word reasonable. So essentially, an employer has to make adjustments for you unless it would be too expensive or impractical. Now, employers are bound by the Equality Act, as we've already heard, to do everything possible to ensure that you can do your job, but there may well be a bit of compromising or flexibility involved. So for instance, let's say that you have a wheelchair user who has started a job for a small company that hires out an office space. So that's quite common these days. You might get a startup or just a smaller organization that hires a space in a building along with lots of different companies. Now, the person in the wheelchair might say, okay, well, as a reasonable adjustment, I'd like a lift so that I can get up to the third floor where you're all based. Now, unfortunately, that small company is unlikely to have the authority to implement a lift or kind of install a lift, in that building. But what they might do is compromise. So they could say, well, perhaps you and a couple of colleagues could work in other places in the building that are more accessible, or perhaps you can balance your time from working on site and also working at home some days. So, an adjustment may not look exactly as you may have first imagined, and there may be a bit of compromising, so that's just something to be aware of. Now, one final thing is on the issue of, cost. Some reasonable adjustments may incur a cost to the employer, but that's nothing for you to worry about because it's their job to implement that. So there might be things that they can't afford to do which require a bit of compromising, but you should never feel as though you're imposing on anyone or that you should be paying for anything. Like, you don't have to pay for any reasonable adjustments. Now, where there might be an issue of cost, Access to Work is a really fantastic scheme. So essentially it works as a grant, and it's available to those who find that the reasonable adjustments implemented by their employer don't go far enough to meet their needs. So it's needs-based, and it could entitle you to the following. So these are just examples, it's not an exhaustive list. So I'll pick a few just to highlight to you. So it could be adaptations to the equipment that you use. It could be taxi fares to work or a support worker if you're not able to use public transport. And it could be disability awareness training for your colleagues. So again, I think this is another really fantastic provision to be aware of as well. So that, again, if there is a bit of a disparity between what you need and what the employer is able to accommodate through reasonable adjustments, this could be a fantastic resource. Okay. All right then, so we've had a think about your rights. So why don't we kind of delve into the trickier stuff of thinking about disclosure? So as we've already mentioned, the decision of whether to disclose is massively personal, And it's going to be influenced by whether you feel like your disability could impact your experience of work, whether that relates to performing your duties or perhaps, settling in with colleagues and the kind of um, work-related things that make up such a massive part of our experience of the working world. However, for those of you who feel like your disability may come into play whilst you're in the workplace, you might decide that you need to share this information, perhaps to access reasonable adjustments or access to work. So as a recent graduate, I think it's likely that some of you listening in may never have had to make a disclosure before, and you might be considering, when is the best time to do this? Like, what are the implications of doing this? And so we're going to be paying particular attention to the different stages that might exist in the recruitment period, which covers, applying for a job, interviewing for a job, and then receiving a job offer. So as I said before, I've decided to kind of hone in on these things because I think they're probably likeliest to be on the horizon for many of you. If you do want to talk about experiences in the workplace, again, that's something that we can talk about in a one-to-one. And I'm also going to give you a short list of kind of external organizations that might also be able to advise you on some of that as well. Okay. All right then, so let's have a look at our first scenario. So when could be the best time to disclose? No, so at the application stage. So I wonder, so this is just a moment for you to reflect. I wonder how many of you would feel inclined to make a disclosure on a CV or cover letter, or perhaps on an application form. Now, I'm going to begin by saying that there's actually no need to mention the fact that you've got a disability on your CV or in a cover letter. Remember, your CV essentially works as a marketing tool. The very best ones display that a candidate has the skills, the competencies, and the potential needed to do the job. So there's absolutely no need to mention a disability or any of the other protected characteristics, on this document. However, there are times where you might want to take control over certain aspects of your CV or your application that might well be left open to interpretation without some additional context. So for instance, when it comes to a disability, depending on how it may have affected you in the past, we know that there could have been times where you're feeling particularly ill, which may have had an impact on your grades for your exams. It could have led to periods of interrupted study. It could also have affected your ability to engage with work experience. Now, employers take our CVs and cover letters at face value, and you might be keen to offer a little bit more context just to put any gaps or grades that don't quite reflect your abilities into context. Now, let me give you an example. So in a previous role, I once had an appointment with a student who had undertaken their degree over a period of 6 years instead of the usual 3 due to a period, periods of illness. So she had to take, periods of interrupted study. And so, she was really concerned by how this might come across to the employer. Whether they doubt her academic ability and therefore ability to do the jobs that she was applying for. So we weighed up the pros and cons of making a disclosure at this stage, and she still felt like this was something that she wanted to do. So when she had made that decision, the next step was to think, okay, well, how best to phrase it then? So in the end, she decided that actually the best course of action, as she saw it, was to place an asterisk next to the university entry on her CV with a really short note that said something like, mitigating circumstances, happy to discuss at a later date. And for her, she felt like this was a really happy medium between having a bit of control over how the CV would be read and, without having to make a full disclosure. So there are sometimes creative ways that may work for you as well, where you don't have to give all of the information, but you can just kind of steer the employer as well and kind of shape how they read your application. So why don't we now think about application forms? So when it comes to application forms, there are some organizations, particularly those which are disability confident, who might invite you to make a disclosure because it entitles you to a reasonable adjustment, like a guaranteed interview, provided you meet their minimum selection criteria. So some of you may have come across that in applying for certain jobs. If a company is disability confident or if they're quite inclusive, they may do they may implement a guaranteed interview scheme. And I think a lot of companies are doing things like this because they accept that actually application forms and CVs may not fully display a disabled candidate's full potential. So actually having you come in for an interview just, gives you another opportunity to talk through your experience face to face. Now, even if you're invited to make a disclosure at that point, of course, it's totally up to you whether you want to do that. So one final note, actually, I think it's worth raising this, is don't be confused by the diversity monitoring form, which is sometimes included as part of a job application pack or an online application. So these are forms that invite you to share information about your background, and usually it's those protected characteristics like your age, race, religion, sexual orientation, blah blah blah. Now, this doesn't count as a disclosure. So if you confirm that you have a disability on the diversity monitoring form, it doesn't count as you making a disclosure. So that's because it's processed in a different way. So, typically your application with all of your kind of job details and your personal statement or cover letter and CV, that will be separated from the diversity monitoring form. And that document just allows companies to keep track of the different groups that make up their organization. So yeah, don't get that confused. So I know that was a slightly garbled explanation. So if you do want to ask any questions about that, or you're not sure about what I mean, do feel free to fire off an email to me and we can talk about that more. Okay then, so that was the application stage. Why don't we then think about interviews? So I wonder, would any of you prefer to disclose once you've been invited to interview as opposed to disclosing on your actual application? So often when an employer invites you to interview, particularly if they maybe email you, you might see an invitation to request reasonable adjustments that you might need just so that you can do your best on the day. So many companies kind of do that as part of their recruitment process and their kind of liaison with you. However, there are some smaller companies or maybe even startups that might be still in the processes of refining their recruitment procedures, and so they may not be quite as proactive about asking. However, remember, it's your right to request and have reasonable adjustments, so you can always raise that with them. So again, if you want to talk through how you might go about raising it, very welcome to book in an appointment, or again, if you can refer to some of the organisations that I'm going to signpost you to a little later on. So you might be thinking, okay, well, what could a reasonable adjustment look like at interview stage? So it could be something like, use of an interpreter, perhaps an amendment to the time of day. So, maybe you're not having to travel during kind of the rush hour, and yeah, just ensuring that you are able to attend at a time of day that works best for you and working around your disability in that regard. Or it could be booking a specific kind of room in a specific location to ensure that you can get to the room and have an interview in the first place. So again, one which is wheelchair accessible or one which is adequately lit. So again, I wonder whether any of you would consider waiting until the actual day of your interview as opposed to when you receive the invitation. So I know that sometimes you might think to yourself, well, I only need them to tweak things a little bit. I won't bother to email them in advance. I'll just bring it up on the day. But actually, sometimes, even small things might need a little bit of careful consideration and planning on the part of the employer. So if you do wait until the actual day of the interview, it might be that there's less scope to implement the kinds of adjustments that you might need. So that's one thing you run the risk of doing if you leave it to the actual day of the interview. Okay then, so we've balanced arguments on both sides for that one. Now we'll look at the final scenario, which is you've actually got the job. So once you've actually received a job offer, you might feel more comfortable with the idea of disclosing your disability. Now, sometimes, again, an employer might invite you to share this information by mentioning reasonable adjustments or perhaps the access to work scheme in their confirmation letter or email. But once again, as we said, if they're smaller or a startup and they haven't raised it for whatever reason, you can always raise that information if you feel comfortable to. Okay, so in terms of who you might share your disability with, I think the best people to direct this information to would be either your line manager or HR, or perhaps even both actually, and cover both bases. Again, with smaller companies or those that have slightly unconventional structures that might not have a clearly defined HR team, and that can happen. I remember I worked for an employer once where there was a kind of a guy who did finance, but he also had HR tacked onto his role. So sometimes it's not quite as clear as it is in bigger organizations. So if you're not clear on who you might make the disclosure to, and you don't feel comfortable kind of just telling just anybody, again, if you want some support with thinking about, okay, well, who might be the most appropriate person to, share that information with, do get in touch or do contact one of these external organizations, because they might be able to help as well and just signpost. All right then, so finding the right environment. So this is the final section of our webinar. And I want to preface this bit by saying, of course, you can work wherever you want. So please don't interpret the next section as me saying that, if you've got a disability, then you have to narrow down your, employment prospects to just this kind of employer, because of course that isn't true. Now, the purpose behind this section, is just to acknowledge that, for many of us with a protected characteristic, or those who might be underrepresented in the workplace, it can be particularly important or just reassuring to find a working environment that is inclusive and clearly recognizes the value of its employees, regardless of their background. So next few slides will give you a chance just to think about how you can identify these kinds of employers and where they might be. So again, it bears repeating, you can work absolutely anywhere. So I'll just get my list up for you. Perfect. All right then, so let's start with disability confident. So I mentioned this a little earlier in our webinar. So the disability confident list is, well, the scheme. It currently involves more than 9,000 organizations, and essentially they provide a framework that allows employers to attract, recruit, and retain disabled staff. So those who sign up commit to implementing different kinds of inclusive practices, and there's level 1, level 2, and level 3. And there's also a link, like they provide on their website a spreadsheet of all of the organizations that have signed up for it as well. So if you're curious about whether someone that you're interested in has signed up for the disability confidence scheme, you can kind of use that spreadsheet to cross-check. But I will say, don't assume that if a company you want to apply for, or if you have applied to them, don't assume that if they're not registered on that list, that they're not prioritizing disability. They may actually be working quite actively to embrace members of staff from different kinds of backgrounds, including disabilities, but they may have their own framework that works for them. So yeah, the other kind of employers or the other institutions that I've got here on this slide are the tip of the iceberg. Like, there are loads of different organizations out there that have specialisms with specific disabilities and how they may manifest in the workplace and can offer quite tailored advice. But I'm going to encourage you just to look into each of these and see which ones are most relevant for you. But there's a lot out there, and again, if you want some further guidance, do feel free to get in touch. So that's pretty much everything from me. It's been really lovely to talk you through some of these key issues, and I do hope you found that useful. As I said, I really hope that it's the start of a discussion rather than you seeing it as the kind of definitive piece around disability at work. And yeah, do feel free just to get in contact at any point if there's anything that wasn't clear or if you'd like further clarification. And one thing to remind you of is, of course, you're very welcome to get a transcript of this presentation in an alternative format as well if you want. All right then, so you take care, and hopefully we'll be in touch very soon. Bye.